The night Chicago was wrapped in a cold wind, the kind that finds its way under your coat no matter how tightly you pull it shut. I remember checking my watch as I made my way into the Grand Oak Grill on Michigan Avenue, a place so polished and bright it made my old boots look like I'd stumbled in from another century. I'd been invited, well summoned, really, by Brian Carter, the man who'd somehow managed to turn my only daughter's head with his expensive charm and sharper tongue. He'd picked the restaurant, the kind of place that serves steaks thicker than your thumb and charges enough that you expect the table to start shaking when the bill comes. Everything about that place was intimidating if you didn't belong. And as soon as I walked in, I felt the eyes, the invisible measuring tape that slid over my cheap flannel and worn jeans. My hands weren't trembling, not yet, but there was a tightness in my chest I hadn't felt since Jessica was little and running a fever in the middle of the night. Maybe deep down I already knew this wasn't going to be the kind of dinner that ends with laughter and dessert. Brian spotted me right away, waving with a smile that never reached his eyes. Jessica sat next to him, her hair swept up, dressed in a way I'd never seen her before, like someone playing the part of a stranger in her own life. The ring on her finger glinted like a warning sign. I sat down, smiled at her, tried to catch some flicker of the little girl I used to know, the one who'd run through the yard chasing fireflies, giggling in the dusk. But her eyes slipped away from mine, busy with the edge of her napkin. That hurt more than the cold. The server brought wine, and Brian took charge like he owned the place. He talked about investments, careers, real estate, people I'd never met but apparently should have known. The conversation was a monologue dressed as a discussion. I nodded, offered a comment now and then, and watched Jessica nod along to everything he said. The distance between us grew with every toast he made to success, every story that ended with a punchline about how money fixes everything. It didn't take long for the true reason behind this dinner to show itself. Brian put down his glass and looked at me the way a man might look at someone he'd found lost on his front lawn. There's a special kind of silence that falls over a table just before someone says something they can't take back. He asked me right out loud what I planned to wear to the wedding. I thought it was a joke at first, tried to laugh it off, but he leaned forward, his smile sharpening, and told me, soft enough to sound private, loud enough that the nearby tables could hear, that people like me don't belong at events like this. I heard the word beggar. My cheeks burned, but I held my tongue, because that's what you do when your daughter is in the room. He went on, laying out in excruciating detail all the ways he felt my presence would ruin his image, his event, his chance to impress the people who mattered. I waited for Jessica to say something, anything, but she just pressed her lips together, twisting her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor. There are moments in life when time doesn't slow down. It actually stops, hangs in the air, trapping you inside your own skin. I felt like I was 12 again, sitting outside the principal's office, waiting to hear what punishment was coming. But this wasn't about detention or a bad grade. This was about everything I'd spent my life building. It was about the pride of a father watching his daughter take her first steps, her first fall, her first dance recital, and realizing she'd chosen someone else's vision of what mattered. She'd chosen money over me. I tried to find words, but they died in my throat. There's a particular ache that comes when the person you've loved more than anything else in this world looks at you like a burden. Brian smiled, pleased with himself, as if he'd finally swept the last bit of dirt off his spotless white tablecloth. The room felt smaller, the ceiling lower, the lights brighter. I noticed other diners stealing glances at our table, the kind of sidelong looks people use when they want to watch a car crash, but pretend they're only admiring the paintwork. I wondered if they could see my hands shaking in my lap. I wondered if Jessica noticed at all. The check arrived before the meal was over, like the universe itself was eager to move on from the awkwardness. Brian signed it with a flourish and thanked the server by name, loud enough for everyone to hear. He stood, offered Jessica his arm, and together they left me sitting there, alone in a room full of strangers. I didn't get angry, not yet. I just felt hollow, like something vital had been scooped out and tossed away. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window and for a moment saw not a father, not a man, but a shadow, someone who had outlived his usefulness. I reached into my wallet for enough cash to pay for my own untouched meal. There was a piece of paper there. A crumpled photo of Jessica when she was 5, grinning with missing teeth, clutching a battered teddy bear. I pressed it between my fingers so tightly I nearly tore it. The walk out of the restaurant was the longest I've ever taken, every step heavy with things unsaid. The doorman didn't meet my eyes as he held the door. Outside, Michigan Avenue buzzed with headlights and horns, the noise of a city that didn't care who had been left behind. My old Chevy was parked a block away. I moved through the cold with my collar up, the city lights throwing long shadows behind me. I sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel, the ghost of Jessica's laughter echoing from years gone by. I didn't start the engine right away. I let myself sit in that moment, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. I could still hear Brian's voice, smooth and venomous. Could still see Jessica's eyes darting away from mine. I wondered if I'd ever see her look at me the same way again. All the way home to Aurora, the city skyline shrinking in my rearview, I replayed that dinner over and over, hunting for some sign, some secret signal, some hint that I'd missed. But there was nothing, just the truth. The world my daughter had chosen was a world that didn't have space for men like me. Or maybe it never had. I stopped once at a quiet park on the edge of the river, the night air heavy with the scent of rain. I sat there for a long time, watching the lights shimmer on the water, thinking about all the things I'd done right and all the things I'd done wrong. The future looked like a locked door with no key. Yet, underneath the bruised pride and the heartbreak, there was something else. A cold, unfamiliar resolve. My father used to say that sometimes the biggest storms come without thunder. You only realize they've changed everything after the sky clears. That night, something shifted in me. I thought about every sacrifice, every missed vacation, every overtime shift I'd worked to keep Jessica clothed, fed, and safe. I thought about how a lifetime of love could be so quickly measured and dismissed by the cut of a suit or the balance in a bank account. But I also thought about the secrets a man can keep, the truths he can hide in plain sight. I thought about what people see and what they choose not to see. As the night deepened, the pain didn't go away, but it changed shape. It grew colder, sharper, something almost useful. If Brian wanted a spectacle, a show of wealth and power, maybe he'd get it, just not in the way he'd ever imagined. I drove home in silence, the steady hum of the engine the only thing tethering me to the present. My hands finally stopped shaking, replaced by a slow, deliberate calm. By the time I parked in front of my little house, the first hints of dawn were touching the horizon. I sat in the driveway for a long time, thinking about everything that had been said, and what still needed to be said. In that quiet, as the world began to wake, I made a promise to myself. No one was ever going to mistake my silence for weakness again. Whatever was coming next, I would not be playing by Brian's rules. And I was certain, as I locked my front door behind me, that something was about to change for all of us. It's strange the way your whole life can feel as if it's shrinking, even as the world outside your window keeps going about its business. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Aurora, the sky was washed in that bruised blue just before dawn, the last stars barely holding on above the roofs of my quiet street. My house, a modest one-story place with peeling white trim and an uneven walkway, looked small but familiar in the early light. For years, it was where I found peace, where my daughter's laughter had once bounced off the kitchen walls, where my wife's voice could still be heard in the hush of the morning. But after that night in the city, everything inside felt different. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, the click echoing down the hall louder than it should have. The silence settled in, pressing at my chest. It was the kind of quiet you get used to after loss, a quiet that becomes a companion, even as it chips away at your edges. I set my keys on the old oak table and stood in the kitchen, hands on the back of a chair, letting the exhaustion seep into my bones. The photos on the fridge caught the first hints of sunlight. Jessica in her college graduation cap, her cheeks red from laughing, and another of all three of us from a long-ago Christmas, my wife, Rebecca, still alive and beautiful, wearing that green sweater she loved. I ran my finger across the dusty frame, remembering the way Rebecca used to hum while making pancakes on Sunday mornings, the way Jessica, as a child, would run circles around the table in her pajamas, wild with joy. I felt that memory sink into me, heavy and warm, and I realized I hadn't seen Jessica laugh like that in years. I poured myself a cup of old coffee, microwaved and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the familiar mess of unpaid bills and grocery lists. I tried to replay the dinner in my head, Brian's words, the flatness in Jessica's eyes. But every time I did, the sense of being unwanted, out of place, grew sharper. I wondered if this was what getting old was supposed to feel like, slowly fading into the background of your own life while everyone else moves on. I missed Rebecca more in that moment than I had in years. She would have known what to say, would have seen right through Brian in a heartbeat. She'd always told me, "Frank, you measure a person by how they treat you when nobody's watching." Now, I was the one nobody saw. After a while, I wandered down the hall to the room that used to be Jessica's. It still smelled faintly of lilac and childhood, though the posters were gone, replaced by empty nail holes in the wall. In the closet, there was a box labeled Dad in Jessica's handwriting. Inside were bits and pieces, Father's Day cards, crayon drawings, a trophy from her first science fair, little reminders that once upon a time, I was her whole world. I closed my eyes and let myself remember what that felt like, before money and pride had wedged themselves between us. That pain, raw and quiet, was sharper than Brian's public insult could ever be. The ache of old regrets started to stir. I thought about the years after Rebecca passed, how hard I'd worked, sometimes 2 jobs at a time, patching roofs in the winter, fixing engines at the old shop on Main Street. There were nights I'd come home too tired to eat, but I'd always peek in on Jessica, asleep with her lamp on, books spread around her like she was building a fort against the world. There was a time when all she needed was for me to be there. How quickly that had changed. After a while, I walked down to the basement, a cool space lined with shelves of old paint cans, tools, and boxes I kept telling myself I'd go through one day. At the back, behind a false wall, was the safe. It was an ugly gray thing, heavy as sin, that I'd bought with the last payout from the plant before it closed. My hands moved automatically over the lock, a combination that was just muscle memory now, Rebecca's birthday, then Jessica's. When the door swung open, I stared at the folders inside. These weren't the kind of treasures people expected. There were no gold bars, no stacks of cash. Just neat files, each one labeled with the name of a company or a date. Apple, Amazon, Tesla, a handful of others. I'd bought the first shares as a whim back in the 90s, when nobody in my world talked about the stock market unless they were joking. I'd stuck with it, picking up more when the price dipped, holding on through every crash and rally. It wasn't luck, not really. It was patience. It was believing in something long after everyone else had stopped paying attention. Over the years, I'd added to the collection old savings bonds from my father, a few blue-chip stocks, some government bonds, paperwork for the house. I didn't live large, never saw the point. Even as the numbers grew on the statements, I kept driving the same old Chevy, wearing boots until the soles wore thin, brown bagging my lunch when I still worked the morning shift at the garage. Jessica never knew. I never wanted her to. I wanted her to believe that the world was about working hard and staying humble, about being the kind of person you could count on, not the kind who'd trade you for a seat at a fancier table. I took out the manila envelope I'd hidden at the very back. It was heavier than I remembered, full of signed forms and legal drafts. My attorney, a patient woman named Ellen Woods, had helped me set up a trust fund for Jessica. $8 million, set to activate the day she got married. Structured so she'd always have something to fall back on, no matter what happened. I'd planned to surprise her with it, to give her the kind of start Rebecca and I could only dream about when we first got married. The irony stung. Now, after everything Brian had said, after the way Jessica had looked at me, I wondered if she'd ever know, or if she even deserved to. I sat in the basement for a long time, sorting through the documents, my fingers moving over the paper, feeling the weight of every decision, every hour spent hunched over an engine or hammering shingles. I thought about what it means to be a father, to give until you're empty, and then to be told that none of it matters. I remembered the last big fight Rebecca and I ever had years ago, about whether we should dip into our savings to pay for Jessica's dance lessons. I'd been stubborn, worried about money, But Rebecca had just smiled and said, "It'll come back to us in ways you can't imagine." She was right, of course, just not in the way I expected. There was a sudden urge to call Jessica, to tell her everything, to beg her to remember all the years when we were all each other had. But pride is a heavy thing, and my pride, battered as it was, wouldn't let me. Instead, I picked up an old Polaroid from the bottom of the safe. Jessica and me at the state fair, her face painted like a butterfly, Rebecca's handwriting on the back. Summer, 2003. Best day ever. I traced the words with my thumb and tried to remember the sound of their laughter, the warmth of Rebecca's hand in mine. As the sun climbed higher, the phone started ringing. It was nothing urgent. A neighbor asking about borrowing a ladder, an old friend checking in. Each call was a reminder that my life had become smaller, quieter, but still full of people who cared. I answered each one with a steady voice, even as I wondered if any of them had ever felt the kind of loneliness I was carrying now. I caught my reflection in the dusty mirror on the stairs. There was gray at my temples, deep lines around my mouth, but my eyes, Rebecca used to say they were kind, held a new kind of resolve. Maybe this was what it meant to get older, to lose the people you love and learn to live with the ache, to find purpose in the quiet. That afternoon, I pulled out a pad of paper and started making lists. It was a habit from the old days, a way to bring order to the chaos. I wrote down everything I still wanted to do. Fix the porch steps, repaint the shutters, call Ellen about changing the terms of the trust. The last item I wrote, in all caps, figure out what comes next. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. I went outside, letting the crisp air wake me up. The neighbor's boy, Tyler, was out front, riding his bike in circles, his shoelaces flapping. He called out, "Hi, Mr. Taylor," and waved. I waved back, remembering the first time Jessica rode a bike, how she'd fallen and scraped her knee and refused to cry. She'd always been tough. I wondered if she still was. Watching Tyler, I felt a pang of longing, not for my youth, but for a time when being a parent meant being a hero, not an embarrassment. Dinner that night was just soup and crackers, but I sat at the table as if expecting company. I thought about the years ahead, about how quickly everything could change. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Brian's words define me, and I wasn't going to let Jessica's choices erase the man I'd worked so hard to become. People like Brian live for applause, for admiration, for the hollow comfort of knowing they're envied. But people like me, we live for something harder to measure: loyalty, sacrifice, the hope that one day, the people you love will see you clearly, even if it takes losing everything for them to understand. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, the house silent around me. I listened for the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock in the hallway. I thought about the safe in the basement, the secrets it held, the life I'd built one quiet day at a time. And somewhere between the darkness and the dawn, I realized I was done waiting for someone else to tell me what I was worth. If Jessica ever wanted to know who her father really was, she'd have to look beyond the old flannel shirts and battered boots. She'd have to remember the lessons I tried to teach her, about love and loyalty and the true cost of pride. The phone call came 2 days after that dinner in Chicago, just as a light drizzle streaked the windows of my living room, blurring the world outside into watery shadows. I'd barely slept since that night, my thoughts looping around Jessica's silence, Brian's smirk, my own helpless anger. Sometimes the worst wounds come not from shouting or slamming doors, but from the quiet that settles in their wake. The house felt smaller, every room echoing with the absence of voices I used to hear daily. When my cell rang, I almost didn't answer, expecting another robocall or a well-meaning friend. But I saw Jessica's name, that familiar pang shooting through me, and for half a second I let myself hope she was calling to say she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake. The hope was gone as soon as she spoke. She didn't ask how I was. Her voice was businesslike, clipped at the edges, like someone reading from a script she didn't care for. She said she was just checking in, and quickly steered the conversation to the wedding, rattling off details about guest lists and seating charts as if we were discussing the weather. I listened, waiting for the moment she'd soften, maybe laugh nervously and ask if we could talk about the other night. That moment never came. Instead, she launched into a problem, barely disguised as a request. The venue had asked for a bigger deposit. The florist needed more money up front. Everything was more expensive than planned, she explained, her tone hinting at disappointment. At me, at herself, at the world for not bending to her wishes. She wanted to know if I could contribute $35,000 to help smooth things over. She said it as though the money were already hers, as if it was just a minor inconvenience to be handled by the man she'd left behind at that table. I tried to swallow my surprise, my hurt, but it came out anyway. I reminded her, gently as I could, of how things had ended that night, how Brian had said I didn't belong, how she hadn't defended me. There was a pause, so thin I could almost hear her thinking. She brushed it off. She said Brian was just under pressure, that he hadn't meant anything by it, that this was about family, about doing what's right. But all I heard was a child who'd forgotten the lessons her parents taught her. She pushed again. It's not about you, Dad. It's just how these things work. That stung most of all, not because of the money, but because of what she'd become, how far she'd drifted from the little girl in those old photographs. I told her I couldn't help. The words felt heavy, final, like setting down a burden I'd carried too long. She didn't argue. She didn't plead or even sound surprised. She just went cold, her voice flattening into something hard and distant. She told me if I wouldn't support her, if I wouldn't help her fit in, then maybe it was better if I didn't come at all. My chest tightened. I asked her if that was what she really wanted. There was another pause, longer this time, filled with all the things we'd never said. She hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at the phone, its blank screen as empty as the room around me. A hollow settled in my gut. I tried to tell myself this was just a phase, that eventually she'd see reason. But some part of me knew better. She had crossed a line, one she didn't even realize was there, and I wasn't sure there was a way back. I moved through the rest of the day like a ghost, doing chores just to keep my hands busy. I mowed the lawn, fixed a loose step on the porch, even cleaned out the gutters as a summer storm threatened the horizon. Every little thing felt like an anchor, holding me to the world while my mind kept drifting back to Jessica, to Rebecca, to the years when love meant something you could count on. When evening came, I went back down to the basement. I opened the safe, pulled out the trust fund documents, and read them again, the legal language suddenly sharp, each line a reminder of what I'd hoped for, what I'd built, what I might have to let go. I thought about changing the will right then and there. I thought about the meaning of family, how it isn't just a matter of blood or obligation, but of choices, of showing up when it's hard, of standing beside someone even when the world is watching. I remembered Rebecca's voice, calm but fierce, saying, "Frank, don't ever let pride keep you from doing the right thing. But don't let people trample your heart, either." It struck me how true that was, how fine a line there is between forgiveness and self-betrayal. The following morning, I called Ellen Woods, my attorney. Her voice was warm, practical, the kind of voice that has seen enough of life to understand disappointment. I asked her what it would take to change the trust, to adjust my will, to protect what I'd built from those who'd forgotten what it cost. She didn't ask for details. She just said she'd start the paperwork, that she'd call me when it was ready. There was no sense of victory in it, just a quiet grief, like closing the door on a room you'd hoped to return to someday. Later that afternoon, I found myself walking into a suit shop downtown, the kind I'd never have set foot in before. The man behind the counter looked at me with a practiced smile, measuring my worth in a glance. I asked for a custom fitting, something classic, dark, the sort of suit a man wears when he wants to be taken seriously. As the tailor measured my shoulders and chest, I wondered if Jessica would even recognize me when she saw me next. Maybe that was the point. I left the shop with a slip of paper and a promise to return for the final fitting. On the way home, I stopped at a high-end car dealership, where the showroom gleamed with polished chrome and quiet power. I didn't buy anything that day. I just ran my hands along the leather interiors, the fine stitching, the sense of possibility humming in the air. I asked about rentals, about chauffeurs, about what it would take to make an entrance no one would forget. The salesman's eyes changed when I mentioned my name, when he saw the account balance, when he realized I could afford whatever I wanted. For the first time in a long while, I felt the power shift, subtle but unmistakable. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, a legal pad open in front of me. I started writing, not a letter but a list, a plan, a way to turn the pain into purpose. I jotted down ideas, notes about the wedding date, the guest list, the little details I'd gleaned from Jessica's call. I called old friends, people who still remembered me as more than a footnote in my daughter's life. I didn't tell them everything, but I let them know I'd need their support soon. Most of them just said, "Whatever you need, Frank." I rehearsed what I'd say if I ever got the chance to speak my truth in front of Jessica, in front of Brian, in front of the crowd that would soon gather to celebrate their union. I wanted them to know I wasn't angry. I wanted them to see what it costs to turn your back on someone who'd carried you this far. I wanted them to understand that wealth isn't just about what you have, but what you give away, and what you lose when you give up your soul in the bargain. A few days later, I walked by the river with Tyler, the neighbor's boy, who was trying to skip stones on the water. He asked me what I'd do if I were rich, if I had all the money in the world. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched the ripples fan out, each one bigger than the last, and thought about what it meant to leave a mark, to be remembered for something more than the money you leave behind. I finally told him, maybe I'd teach somebody a lesson they'll never forget. As the days ticked by, I felt myself changing. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer the kind that makes you weak. It was the kind that steels you for what comes next. I started to see the coming wedding not as a door closing, but as a stage, one last chance to show Jessica, to show everyone, who I really was. When Ellen called to say the new documents were ready, I went downtown and signed them in her office. She watched me with kind eyes, her pen clicking quietly on the desk. As I left, she pressed my hand and said, "You're doing the right thing, Frank. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their own choices." Her words stayed with me all the way home. I spent that night practicing my speech in the bathroom mirror, my reflection a stranger in a suit. I spoke softly at first, then louder, then softer again, trying to find the right balance between pride and heartbreak. I thought about Rebecca, about all the years we'd built together, about how quickly it could all unravel if you let the wrong people write your story. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen. Not this time. In the weeks after that call with Jessica, the world took on a sharper edge, as if every moment had been sanded down to something raw and unfinished. I kept busy with repairs around the house, putting up storm windows and patching the old roof before the rains came. Sometimes the only way to stop your mind from spinning is to keep your hands working. Still, beneath the motions of daily life, something else was building. A sense of purpose that was equal parts anger and clarity. There's a certain freedom in letting go, in deciding that if you're going to be cut out, you might as well make your absence unforgettable. I drove into the city the following Saturday, the streets buzzing with spring energy, everyone hustling past with their coffee cups and unreadable expressions. It struck me how anonymous a person can feel in a place they've known for decades. I found the tailor shop tucked between a bakery and a bookstore, both of which seemed determined to outdo each other with their window displays. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with cedar. The tailor, a thin man with a quick smile, measured me with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of seeing straight through to a person's real size. As he chalked lines on fine navy wool, he asked about the occasion. I told him I had a wedding to attend, and that it might just change everything. He nodded as if he understood. Next, I stopped by the dealership. The showrooms gleamed with cars so new they still smelled of money and secrets. I'd always thought people bought these things to show the world what they wanted to be, not what they were. Still, I had to admit there was a thrill to sitting behind the wheel of something that felt like it could fly. The salesman, a polished man with a gold watch and a sharp smile, showed me options that made my head spin. I listened, asked questions, and in the end requested a rental, 1 day only, chauffeur included. I left with a contract in my pocket, the confirmation number like a silent promise that soon, someone would have to see me for what I really was. I spent the afternoons making lists, calling lawyers, crossing things off and adding new lines. Ellen, my attorney, handled everything with calm precision, drafting new documents and ensuring every signature, every clause was airtight. It felt surreal, holding the weight of years in a single stack of papers. My entire life, distilled to numbers and signatures, ready to be handed over or taken away at a moment's notice. Sometimes I caught myself staring out the window, wondering how things might have gone if Rebecca were still here. She'd have been furious on my behalf, but she'd also have reminded me not to lose myself in the storm. I clung to that memory, to the sound of her voice in my mind, as I made arrangements that would outlast this pain. There was an evening when I found myself at the river, the same spot where I used to take Jessica fishing on lazy Sundays. The water moved slow and sure, old tree roots dipping their fingers into the current. I sat on the bench and watched as a pair of ducks drifted by, their movements simple and unhurried. I tried to remember the last time I truly relaxed, the last time Jessica had curled up beside me and asked about the future. The truth was, I couldn't recall. Somewhere along the way, the future had become something I built for her, not with her. A day or two later, an invitation arrived in the mail. Not from Jessica or Brian, but a formal card from the wedding planner, addressed with precise script. It wasn't a gesture of love, just a polite notification. Your presence is required. Your attendance will be tolerated. I studied the invitation, running my thumb over the gold letters, and felt a chill run through me. There was no mention of father of the bride. Just my name, written as if I were an afterthought. I set it aside, deciding then and there that my appearance would be anything but forgettable. Each night, I rehearsed what I might say, how I might look at Jessica across the crowded room. I played out 100 scenarios, some ending in shouting, others in silence. I imagined Brian, smug and sure, basking in the applause of people who valued him for his wealth, not his character. It was almost comical to picture him losing his composure, watching the foundation of his carefully built world begin to crack. I called an old friend, Mike, who'd retired from the force last year. We'd spent years playing cards together at the VFW, sharing stories of the people we'd loved and lost. Mike knew enough about my situation to offer help without asking too many questions. When I told him what I planned, he just said, "Make it count, Frank." His words echoed in my mind, a steady beat that carried me through the doubts and second-guessing that threatened to creep in. As the wedding day drew closer, I started noticing the small ways I'd changed. I walked taller, spoke less, but with more conviction. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. In the hardware store, at the grocery, even just standing in line at the post office, I saw people differently. It was as if losing Jessica, at least for now, had stripped away a layer of hesitation. I was no longer a man waiting for approval. I was someone who knew exactly what he was worth, even if no one else could see it. There were moments of weakness, of course. Late at night, I'd wake from dreams where Rebecca was still alive, where Jessica was little again, running barefoot through the grass with her hair wild and free. I'd hear their laughter and feel it reverberate through the house, shaking loose the loneliness that settled there in the quiet. But then I'd wake, the dream fading like mist, and the ache would return. It wasn't bitterness that kept me going, but a kind of stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, Jessica would see, even if it took the loss of everything she thought she wanted. I finalized my plans with the tailor and the dealership. I spent an afternoon going over the trust documents with Ellen, making sure every contingency was accounted for. There was a moment, pen in hand, when she looked at me and said, "You sure about this?" I nodded, a certainty settling in my gut that felt both frightening and freeing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't acting out of fear or habit. I was making a choice. On the eve of the wedding, I took a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the trees heavy with new leaves. Tyler, the neighbor's boy, was outside playing catch with his father. Their laughter floated through the twilight, a reminder that some things endure, no matter what storms roll in. I waved, and Tyler called out, "See you at the party, Mr. Taylor." I smiled, feeling the weight of the moment, knowing tomorrow would change everything. When I returned home, I laid out the suit on my bed, the fabric smooth and strong beneath my fingers. I polished my shoes, checked the watch Rebecca gave me on our 10th anniversary, and slipped the trust documents into a leather folder. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, seeing not just an old man, but the sum of 1,000 choices, some wise, some foolish, all made with love. That night, I slept deeper than I had in weeks. In the darkness, I dreamed of standing in a room full of strangers, my voice steady and clear as I spoke the truth. I woke with the sunrise, the day of reckoning finally here. There was a peace in me now, a resolve that no insult or betrayal could shake. Whatever happened at that wedding, I would walk in as myself and walk out unburdened, come what may. Morning came to Aurora with a clear, bright sky, sunlight streaming through my kitchen window and painting everything in gold. I brewed coffee, moving through the house with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The suit was waiting for me, the shoes shining by the door, the folder with all my documents and Ellen's carefully worded letters tucked inside my jacket. When the car pulled up, a gleaming black sedan with a quiet, confident driver in a sharp suit, I realized just how much had changed. The neighbors peeked through their curtains as I stepped out, their faces a blend of curiosity and surprise, as if they hardly recognized the man walking down the driveway. Tyler waved from his front yard, his dad nodding respectfully. For the first time, I felt something like anticipation instead of dread. There was no way back now. The ride to Lake Michigan was smooth, the city growing more extravagant the closer we got to the waterfront. Hotels lined the street, their entrances draped in fresh flowers and silver bunting, valets hustling to open doors for guests who stepped out in tuxedos and glittering gowns. The wedding was being held at the Ridgeway, a place so grand it looked like it belonged on another continent. Vaulted ceilings, marble columns, a terrace that looked out over the water, the kind of view that people paid a fortune just to photograph. The car glided up to the entrance, drawing the eyes of the crowd already gathered outside. I stepped out, handed the driver a tip, and walked inside, every head turning as I passed. The old feeling of being invisible, of being less than, had disappeared somewhere between my house and here. Inside, the reception area was a sea of people. Brian's relatives in clusters, Jessica's old friends huddled together, faces I hadn't seen in years. There was music playing softly, the scent of fresh lilies filling the room, waiters weaving through the guests with trays of champagne. I stood for a moment, taking it all in. Every detail was perfect, every surface gleaming, but there was a chill beneath the luxury, a sense of performance. When I caught sight of Jessica, standing near the far window, I felt a stab of something I couldn't name. Grief, pride, fear, maybe all of it mixed together. She was beautiful, radiant in her gown, surrounded by people who admired her. But when she looked at me, her expression flickered, a hesitation crossing her face before she smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Brian was beside her, laughing too loudly, his hand on her back in a gesture of ownership. People watched me as I made my way through the crowd, nodding politely, their eyes lingering just a second too long. I greeted Jessica, told her she looked lovely, and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Brian shook my hand with a forced friendliness, his grip too tight, his eyes searching mine for some sign of weakness. There was a tension in the air that no one wanted to acknowledge, an invisible line drawn across the floor. I stood quietly, waiting, knowing that soon the show would begin. When the music faded and the wedding coordinator called for everyone's attention, a hush settled over the room. The ceremony itself was brief. Readings about love and loyalty, vows exchanged beneath an arch of roses, Jessica's voice trembling only once. There were no tears, just applause, flashes from a dozen cameras, and the sense that everyone was performing their part. I watched, feeling oddly detached, as if I were seeing my own life from the outside. It was after the ceremony, as guests filed into the ballroom for dinner, that the real drama began. The ballroom was lit by crystal chandeliers, every table set with gold-rimmed china and tall vases of white tulips. I found my seat, not at the family table but off to the side, next to people I barely knew. It was a small slight, but it landed with more weight than I expected. I sipped my wine, letting the conversations flow around me, watching Jessica and Brian make their rounds, collecting compliments and congratulations. Every so often, Jessica would glance my way, her smile slipping for a moment before she pulled it back into place. Then came the toasts. Brian's father spoke first, his words grandiose and full of praise for his son's ambition, his drive, his vision for the future. Friends followed, telling stories of wild nights and business deals, of a man who always came out on top. When it was my turn, the room grew quiet. The microphone was cold in my hand, the light bright on my face. For a moment, all I could see was Jessica at 6, climbing into my lap after scraping her knee, her tears drying as I told her she was the bravest kid I knew. I cleared my throat, glanced at my daughter, then out at the sea of faces. Some friendly, some wary, some just curious. I spoke simply at first, thanking everyone for being there, for loving Jessica, for welcoming me, even if only in a way that kept me at a polite distance. I told them a little about raising her, about the nights when she was sick, the first days of school, the years after Rebecca died. I spoke about sacrifice, about the quiet work that holds a family together, about love that endures even when it isn't returned in the way you hoped. But then I let the mask drop. I told them I'd heard what was said about me, that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, that I was a burden. I didn't say who said it. I didn't have to. The silence was thick as honey. I reached for the folder, opening it, laying the trust documents on the table in front of me. I explained what they were, how I'd built them year after year, not as a monument to myself, but as a way to give Jessica a future. I said I'd intended, up until recently, to give it all to her on this day, to mark the beginning of a new chapter with a gift that would last long after I was gone. Then I looked at Brian, at Jessica, at everyone in the room, and I told them the truth. I told them about respect, how it can't be bought or faked, how once you lose it, it's almost impossible to win back. I told them that love, real love, doesn't measure itself by bank accounts or wedding venues, but by the way you treat people when no one's looking. I announced calmly that I was giving the trust fund not to Jessica, not to Brian, but to a foundation that provided scholarships for kids from families like mine. Families who believed in hope even when all they had was each other. The gasp from the crowd was real and immediate. Brian's face went white, his confidence collapsing, his mouth opening in disbelief. Jessica's hands shook, the glass in her hand trembling. There was a ripple of whispers, shock moving through the room like electricity. I looked at my daughter, my voice gentle but unyielding. I told her I loved her, that I always would, but that I wouldn't reward contempt with comfort. I hoped one day she'd understand. Brian rose to speak, but the room had shifted. The applause came not from his side of the family, but from strangers, from people who saw not just the money but the meaning behind it. I thanked everyone again, set the microphone down, and walked from the table with my head high. I felt the weight leave my shoulders with every step. In the hallway, I paused. I could hear Jessica's voice, pleading, the beginnings of tears. Brian arguing, defensive and loud. Someone from the Scholarship Foundation approached me, his gratitude quiet and sincere. I shook his hand, accepting nothing but his thanks. As I walked outside, the night air was cool, the lights from the ballroom spilling out onto the steps. I stood for a moment, letting the city's sounds wash over me, a mix of laughter, confusion, and the soft hush of disappointment. My ride was waiting, the driver greeting me with a quiet nod. As we pulled away, I glanced back once, seeing Jessica framed in the doorway, her face wet with tears, Brian behind her, his world suddenly smaller. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad, but also free, as if I'd finally said everything that needed saying. The car moved through the city, streetlights flickering past, and I knew I'd never have to apologize for who I was again. The city lights grew smaller in the rearview as the car wound its way out of Chicago, the wedding receding behind me like a closed chapter. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, watching as the skyline blurred and the roads grew quieter, the driver silent and respectful. I felt hollowed out and impossibly light at the same time, the ache of what had just unfolded competing with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I wondered if, When the morning sun came up, I'd feel regret for what I'd done, or if the emptiness would settle into something softer, like relief. As the miles slipped past, my mind drifted back and forth through time. Jessica at 3, clutching my hand on her first day of preschool. Rebecca's laughter from the kitchen. The long, hard years spent building a life out of simple things and stubborn hope. The house welcomed me with its familiar creaks and quiet, the scent of wood polish lingering from my half-hearted cleaning spree the day before. I stood in the foyer, the folder with the signed documents still heavy in my hand, and listened for any echo of the chaos I'd left behind. There was none, just the steady ticking of the clock in the living room, the gentle hum of the fridge, the small, ordinary sounds that had once seemed empty but now felt like a kind of peace. I hung my jacket, placed the folder on the table, and stood for a while, looking at the framed photos lined up on the mantel. One of Jessica and me at the state fair, Rebecca beaming beside us. Another of the 3 of us at the lake, the sun caught in Jessica's hair. Those images had always comforted me, but now they pressed at my chest, bittersweet and unresolved. The next morning came with gray skies and a soft rain that pattered against the windows. I made coffee and sipped it at the kitchen table, the city's news already abuzz with stories of the wedding, mysterious father donates fortune, a family torn apart by pride. There was talk of my speech, of Brian's pale face, of Jessica's tears. People I barely remembered called or texted, some to offer congratulations, others to ask for details, their curiosity sharp-edged and hungry. I answered no one, choosing instead to sit in the stillness, trying to make sense of what it all meant. By noon, the phone rang again. This time, Jessica's number, blinking like an old warning light. I stared at it for a long moment before picking up, my heart pounding hard enough that I had to steady my breathing. Her voice was small, raw around the edges, and for a second she sounded so young I nearly lost my resolve. She started by saying she was sorry, that she hadn't understood, that things had gotten out of hand. She wanted to know why I did what I did, why I hadn't warned her, why I couldn't have just forgiven her, just given her what she'd always believed was coming. I listened, letting her words spill out, letting her try to patch the crack that had split between us. I told her gently that love wasn't a debt, that forgiveness didn't erase consequence, that sometimes the only way people learn is to feel the absence of what they took for granted. There was a silence, heavy and unresolved, before she whispered that she didn't know if she could ever forgive me for embarrassing her, for ruining the day she'd dreamed of for years. I said that some choices carry weight, that sometimes the only way to change is to lose something precious. I wished her happiness, told her I would always love her, and ended the call before either of us could say something we'd regret. The days after passed slowly. The media's interest burned out quickly, replaced by the next scandal, the next viral moment. Neighbors gossiped, friends reached out with cautious sympathy, and the Scholarship Foundation sent me a letter of thanks, their gratitude honest and moving. The world, I realized, moved on whether you were ready or not. I threw myself into small projects, painting the porch swing, fixing the leaky faucet, weeding the stubborn patch of wildflowers that Rebecca had planted years ago. It was strange, almost comforting, how life refused to stop, how the ordinary rhythms of living could still anchor you even as the big things shifted beneath your feet. One evening, Tyler knocked on my door, a baseball glove in his hand and an uncertain look on his face. He asked if I wanted to play catch, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. We tossed the ball back and forth in the fading light, our breaths misting in the cool air. He didn't ask about the wedding or the money or Jessica. He just asked if I'd ever missed someone so much it felt like your bones ached. I told him yes more than once. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and purple, I realized that loss was something you learn to live with, not by forgetting, but by remembering differently. As summer deepened, I wrote a letter to Jessica. I told her the truth, not just about the money, but about the years of sacrifice, the silent hopes, the heartbreaks and small joys that made our family what it was. I wrote that love was the only real inheritance I ever wanted to give her, that everything else was just numbers on a page. I sealed the letter, unsure if I'd ever send it, but relieved to have said what needed saying. Occasionally, news of Brian filtered back to me. His job under scrutiny, business partners distancing themselves, the easy confidence replaced by a bitterness that seemed to cling to him. I took no joy in it. Pride can shatter a person just as surely as betrayal. Jessica moved to a smaller place, cut her hair short, started volunteering at a local shelter. Sometimes, from a distance, I saw a glimmer of the girl I'd once known. She called less often, but when she did, her voice was softer, more real. Our conversations were short, careful, but there was a hint of possibility in them, like the first tentative green after a long winter. People in town debated what had happened. Some said I'd been cruel, that family was worth more than pride. Others thought I was right, that respect couldn't be bought, that love without honesty is hollow. The story lingered, a lesson in whispers and half-remembered details, its meaning shifting depending on who was telling it. I learned to live with the ambiguity, to accept that not every wound can be healed, that sometimes the best you can do is to hold on to your own sense of rightness. Rebecca's birthday came in early fall. I visited her grave, the grass cool beneath my knees, the air sharp with the promise of change. I told her everything, about Jessica, about the wedding, about the storm I'd walked through and the peace I was finally finding on the other side. I left wildflowers on the stone, the same kind she used to pick for the kitchen table. As I drove home, I felt her presence, not as a voice, but as a memory woven through every part of my life. In the end, the world didn't fall apart. The house stayed standing, the porch swing creaked in the wind, and I learned to enjoy my morning coffee again. I walked Tyler to school, fixed things for the neighbors, mowed the grass in neat lines. Sometimes, when the light was just right, I thought I saw Jessica in the garden, a flash of laughter, a hint of forgiveness in the air. There was no grand reconciliation, no movie ending. Just the slow work of living, of letting pain settle and soften, of trusting that the lessons you taught, by word, by action, by sacrifice, might one day bear fruit, even if you never get to see it bloom. I lived with hope, stubborn and quiet, that love was never wasted, that kindness mattered, and that somewhere, deep down, Jessica understood.